Chapter 4 The Unconscious Origin of the Hero. Prepared by the previous chapters, we approach the personification of a libido in the form of a conqueror, a hero, or a demon. With this symbolism leaves the interpersonal and neutral realm, which characterizes the astral and meteorologic symbol, and takes human form. The figure of a being changing from sorrow to joy, from joy to sorrow, and which, like the sun, sometimes stands in its zenith, sometimes is plunged in darkest night, arises from this very night to new splendor. Just as the sun, guided by its own internal laws, ascends from morning till noon, and passing beyond the noon descends towards evening, leaving behind its splendor, and then sinks completely into the all-enveloping night, thus too does mankind follow his course according to immutable laws, and also sinks after his course is completed into night, in order to rise again in the morning to a new cycle in his children. The symbolic transition from sun to man is easy and practical. The third and last creation of Miss Miller also takes this course. She calls this piece Chihuahua, a hypnagogic poem. She gives us the following information about the circumstances surrounding the origin of the fantasy. After an evening of care and anxiety, I lay down to sleep at about 11:30. I felt excited and unable to sleep, although I was very tired. There was no light in the room. I closed my eyes, and then I had the feeling that something was about to happen. The sensation of a general relaxation came over me, and I remained as passive as possible. Lines appeared before my eyes, sparks and shining spirals, followed by a kaleidoscope review of recent trivial occurrences. The reader will regret with me that we cannot know the reason for her cares and anxieties. It would have been of great importance for what follows to have information on this point. This gap in our knowledge is the more to be deplored because between the first poem in 1898 and the time of the fantasy here discussed in 1902, 4 whole years have passed. All information is lacking regarding the period during which the great problem surely survived in the unconscious. Perhaps this lack has its advantage in that our interest is not diverted from the universal applicability of the fantasy here produced by sympathy in regard to the personal fate of the author. Therefore something is obviated which often prevents the analyst in his daily tank from looking away from the tedious toil of detail to that wider relation which reveals each neurotic conflict to be involved with human fate as a whole. The condition depicted by the author have corresponded to such a one as usually precedes an international somnambulism. Often described by spiritualistic mediums, a certain inclination to listen to these low nocturnal voices must be assumed. Otherwise such fine and hardly perceptible inner experiences pass unnoticed. We recognize in this listening a current of a libido, leading inward and beginning to flow toward a still invisible mysterious goal. It seems that the libido has suddenly discovered an object in the depths of the unconscious which powerfully attracts it. The life of man, turned wholly to the external by nature, does not ordinarily prevent such introversion. There must therefore be surmised a certain exceptional condition, that is to say, a lack of external objects which compels the individual to seek a substitute for them in his own soul. It is, however, difficult to imagine that this rich world has become too poor to offer an object for the love of human atoms, nor can the world and its objects be held accountable for this lack. It offers boundless opportunities for everyone. It is rather the incapacity to love which robs mankind of his possibilities. This world is empty to him alone, who does not understand how to direct his libido towards objects and to render them alive and beautiful for himself, for beauty does not indeed lie in things, but in the feeling that we give to them. That which compels us to create a substitute for ourselves is not the external lack of objects, but our incapacity to lovingly include a thing outside of ourselves. Certainly the difficulties of the conditions of life and the adversities of the struggle for existence may oppress us. Yet even adverse external situations would not hinder the giving out of libido. On the contrary, they may spur us on to the greatest exertions whereby we bring our whole libido into reality. Real difficulties alone will never be able to force the libido back permanently to such a degree as to give rise, for example, to a neurosis. The conflict which is the condition of every neurosis is lacking. The resistance which opposes its unwillingness to the will alone has the power of produce that pathogenic introversion which is the starting point of every psychogenic disturbance. The resistance against loving produces the inability to love. Just as the normal libido is comparable to a steady stream which pours its waters broadly into a world of reality, so the resistance, dynamically considered, is comparable not so much to a rock rearing up in a river bed which is flooded over or surrounded by the stream, as to a backward flow towards the source. A part of the soul desires the outer object, another part, however, harks back to the subjective world, where the airy and fragile places of fantasy beckon. One can assume the dualism of the human will, for which Bleuer, from the psychiatric point of view, has coined the word ambitendency as something generally present, bearing in mind that even the most primitive motor impulse is in opposition. As, for example, in the active extension, the flexor muscles also become innervated. This normal ambitendency, however, never leads to an inhibition of prevention of the intended act, but is the indispensable preliminary requirement for its perfection and coordination. For resistance disturbing to this act to arise from the harmony of finely attuned opposition, an abnormal plus or minus would be needed on one or the other side. The resistance originates from this added third. This applies also to the duality of the will, from which so many difficulties arise for mankind. The abnormal third frees the pair of opposites, which are normally most intimately united, and causes their manifestation in the form of separate tendencies. It is only thus that they become willingness and unwillingness, which interfere with each other. The Bhagavad Gita says, "Be thou free of the pairs of opposites." The harmony thus becomes disharmony. It cannot be my task here to investigate whence the unknown third arises, and that it is. Taken at the roots in the case of our patients, the nuclear complex reveals itself as the incest problem. The sexual libido regressing to the parents appears as the incest tendency. The reason this path is so easily traveled is due to the enormous indolence of mankind, which will relinquish no object of the past but will hold it fast forever. The sacrilegious backward grasp of which Nietzsche speaks reveals itself stripped of its incest covering as an original passive arrest of the libido in its first object of childhood. The indolence is also a passion, as La Rochefort has brilliantly expressed it. Of all passions, that which is least known to ourselves is indolence. It is the most ardent and malignant of them all. Although its violence may be insensible and the injuries it causes may be hidden, if we will consider its powers attentively, we will see that it makes itself upon all occasions mistress of our sentiments, of our interests, and of our pleasures. It is the anchor which has the power to arrest the largest vessels. It is a calm more dangerous to the most important affairs than rocks in the worst tempest. The repose of indolence is a secret charm of the soul which suddenly stops the most ardent pursuits and the firmest resolutions. Finally, to give the true idea of this passion, one must say that indolence is like a beatitude of the soul, which counsels it for all its losses and takes the place of all its possessions. This dangerous passion, belonging above all others to primitive man, appears under the hazardous mask of the incest symbol, from which the incest fear must drive us away, and which must be conquered in the first place under the image of a terrible mother. It is the mother of innumerable evils, not the least of which are neurotic troubles. For especially from the fogs of the arrested remnants of a libido arise the harmful phantasmagoria, which is so veil reality that adaptation becomes almost impossible. However, we will not investigate any further in this place the foundations of the incest fantasies. The preliminary suggestion of my purely psychologic conception of the incest problem may suffice. We are here only conquered with the question whether resistance which leads to introversion in our offers signifies a conscious external difficulty or not. If it were an external difficulty, then indeed the libido would be violently dammed back and would produce a flood of fantasies which can best be designated as schemes, that is to say, plans as to how the obstacles should be overcome. They would be very concrete ideas of reality which seek to pave the way for solutions. It would be a strenuous meditation, indeed, which would be more likely to lead to anything rather than to a hypnotic poem. The passive condition depicted above is no way fits with a real external obstacle, but precisely through its passive submission, it indicates a tendency which doubtless scorns real solutions and prefers phantastic substitutes. Ultimately and essentially, we are therefore dealing with an internal conflict, perhaps after the manner of those earlier conflicts which led to the first two unconscious creations. We therefore are forced to conclude that the external object cannot be loved, because a predominant amount of libido prefers a phantastic object, which must be brought up from the depths of the unconscious as a compensation of the missing reality. The visionary phenomena produced in the first stages of introversion are grouped among the well-known phenomena of hypnotic vision. They form, as I explained in an earlier paper, the foundation of the true visions of the symbolic auto-revelations of a libido, as we may now express it. Miss Miller continues, then I had the impression that some communication was immediately impending. It seems to me as if there were re-echoed in the words, "Speak, O Lord, for thy servant listens. Open thou mine ears." This passage very clearly describes the intention. The expression communication is even a current term in spiritualistic circles. The biblical words contain a clear invocation or prayer, that is to say, a wish libido directed towards divinity or the unconscious complex. The prayer refers to Samuel, where Samuel at night was 3 times called by God, believed that it was Eli calling, until the later informed him that it was God himself who spoke, and that he must answer if his name was called again. "Speak, O Lord, for thy servant hears." The dreamer uses these words really in an inverse sense, namely in order to produce God with him. With that, she directs her desires, her libido, into the depths of her unconscious. We know that although individuals are widely separated by the differences in the contents of their consciousness, they are closely alike in their unconscious psychology. It is a significant impression for one working in practical psychoanalysis when he realizes how uniform are the typical unconscious complexes. Differences first arise from individualization. This fact gives to an essential portion of the Schopenhauer and Hartmann philosophies a deep psychologic justification. The very evident uniformity of the unconscious mechanism serves as a psychologic foundation for these philosophic views. The unconscious contains the differentiated remnants of the earlier psychologic functions overcome by the individual differentiation. The reaction and products of the animal psyche and of a general diffused uniformity and solidity, which among men may be discovered apparently only in traces. Man appears as something extraordinarily individual in contrast with animals. This might be a tremendous delusion because we have the appropriate tendency always to recognize only the difference of things. This is demanded by the psychologic adaptation, which without the most minute differentiation of the impressions would be absolutely impossible. In opposition to this tendency, we have ever the greatest difficulty in recognizing in their common relations the things which we are occupied in everyday life. This recognition becomes much easier with things that are more remote from us. For example, it is almost impossible for a European to differentiate the faces in a Chinese throng, although the Chinese have just as individual facial formations as the Europeans. But the similarity of their strange facial expressions is much more evident to the remote onlooker in their individual differences. But when we live among the Chinese, then the impression of their uniformity disappears more and more, and finally the Chinese become individuals also. Individuality belongs to those conditional actualities which are greatly overrated theoretically on account of their practical significance. It does not belong to those overwhelmingly clear and therefore universally obtrusive general facts upon which a science must primarily be founded. The individual contents of consciousness is therefore the most favorable object imaginable for psychology, because it has veiled the universally valid until it has become unrecognizable. The essence of consciousness is the process of adaptation which takes place in the most minute details. On the other hand, the unconscious is the generally diffused, which not only binds the individuals among themselves to the race, but also unties them backwards with the peoples of the past and their psychology. Thus, the unconscious, surpassing the individual in its generality, is in the first place the object of a true psychology, which claims not to be psychophysical. Man as an individual is a suspicious phenomenon, the right of whose existence from a natural biological standpoint could be seriously contested. Is from this point of view, the individual is only a race atom, and has a significance only as a mass constituent. The ethical standpoint, however, gives to the human being an individual tendency separating him from the mass, which in the course of centuries led to the development of personality, hand in hand with which developed the hero cult, and has led to the modern individualistic cult of personages. The attempts of rationalistic theology to keep hold of a personal Jesus as the last and most precious remnant of the divinity which has vanished beyond the power of the imagination corresponds to this tendency. In this respect, the Roman Catholic Church was more practical because she met the general need of a visible, or at least historically believed hero, through the fact that she placed upon the throne of worship a small but clearly perceptible god of the world, namely the Roman Pope, the Pater Patrum, and at the same time the Pontifex Maximus of the invisible upper or inner god. The sensuous demonstrability of God naturally supports the religious process of introversion, as the human figure essentially facilitates the transference, for it is not easy to imagine something lovable or venerable in a spiritualistic being. This tendency, everywhere present, has been secretly preserved in the rationalistic theology, with its Jesus historically insisted upon. This does not mean that men love the visible God. They love him, not as he is, for he is merely a man, and when the pious wish to love humanity, they could go to their neighbors and their enemies to love him. Mankind wishes to love in God only their ideas, that is to say, the ideas which they project into God. By that they wish to love their unconscious, that is, that remnant of the ancient humanity in the century-old past in all people, namely the common property left behind from all development which is given to all men, like the sunshine and the air. But in loving this inheritance, they love that which is common to all. Thus they turn back to the mother of humanity, that is to say, to the spirit of a race, and regain in the way something of that connection and of that mysterious and irresistible power which is imparted by the feeling of belonging to the herd. It is the problem of Antaeus, who preserves his gigantic strength only through contact with Mother Earth. This temporary withdrawal into oneself, which, as we have already seen, signifies a regression to the childish bond to the parent, seems to act favorably with certain limits in its effect upon the psychologic condition of the individual. It is in general to be expected that the two fundamental mechanisms of the psychosis, transference and introversion, are to a wide extent extremely appropriate methods of normal reaction against complexes. Transference is a means of escaping from the complex into reality. Introversion is a means of detaching oneself from reality through the complex. After we have informed ourselves about the general purposes of prayer, we are prepared to hear more about the vision of our dreamer. After the prayer, the head of a sphinx with an Egyptian's headdress appeared, only to vanish quickly. Here the author was disturbed so that for a moment she awoke. This vision recalls the previously mentioned fantasy of the Egyptian statue, whose rigid gesture is entirely in place here as a phenomena of a so-called functional category. The light stages of a hypnosis are designated technically as engourdissement or stiffening. The word sphinx in the whole civilized world signifies the same as riddle. A puzzling creature who proposes riddles like the Sphinx of Oedipus, standing at the portal of his fate like a symbolic proclamation of the inevitable. The Sphinx is a semi-pharamorphic representation of that mother image which may be designated as the terrible mother, of whom many traces are found in mythology. The interpretation is correct for Oedipus. Here the question is open, the objection will be raised that nothing except the word Sphinx justifies the allusion to Sphinx of Oedipus. On account of a lack of subjective materials which in the Miller text are wholly lacking in regard to the vision, an individual interpretation would also be excluded. The suggestion of an Egyptian fantasy, Part 1, Chapter 2, is entirely insufficient to be employed here. Therefore, we are compelled, if we wish to venture at all upon an understanding of this vision, to direct ourselves, perhaps in all too daring a manner, to the available infographic material under the assumption that the unconscious of a present-day man coins its symbols as was done in the most remote past. The Sphinx in its traditional form is half-human, half-animal creature, which we must in part interpret in the way that is applicable to such fantastic products. The reader is directed to the deductions in the first part of this volume, where the pharamorphic representations of the libido were discussed. This manner of representation is very similar to the analyst, though the dreams and fantasies of neurotics and of normal men. The impulse is readily represented as an animal, as a bull, horse, dog, etc. One of my patients who had questionable relations with a woman, and who began the treatment with the fear, so to speak, that I should surely forbid him the sexual adventures, dreamed that I, his physician, very skillfully separated to the wall a strange animal, half pig, half crocodile. Dreams swarm with such pharamorphic representations of the libido. Mixed beings such are in the dream are not rare. A series of very beautiful illustrations where especially the lower half of the animal is represented pharamorphically has been furnished by Bertschinger. The libido, which was represented pharamorphically in the animal sexuality, is in a repressed state. The history of repression, as we have seen, goes back to the incest problem, where the first motives for moral resistance against sexuality display themselves. The objects of a repressed libido are in the last degree the images of father and mother. Therefore, the pharamorphic symbols, in so far as they do not symbolize merely the libido in general, have a tendency to present father and mother, for example, father represented by a bull, mother by a cow. From these roots, as they have pointed out earlier, might probably arise the pharamorphic attributes of a divinity. And as far as the repressed libido manifests itself under certain conditions as anxiety, these animals are generally of a horrible nature. In consciousness, we are attached by all sacred bonds to the mother, and in the dream she pursues us as a terrible animal. The Sphinx, mythologically considered, is actually a fear animal, which reveals distinct traits of a mother derivative. In the Oedipus legend, the Sphinx is sent by Hera, who hates Thebes on account of a birth of Bacchus, because Oedipus conquers the Sphinx, which is nothing but fear of a mother. He must marry Jocasta, his mother, for the throne in the hand of a widowed queen of Thebes, belonged to him who freed the land from the plague of the Sphinx. The genealogy of the Sphinx is rich in allusions to the problem touched upon here. She is a daughter of Enshita, a mixed being, a beautiful maiden above a hideous serpent below. This double creature corresponds to the picture of a mother above. The human, lovely, and attractive half below the horrible animal half converted into a fear animal through the incest prohibition. Echinida is derived from the All-Mother, the Mother Earth Gaia, who with Tartaros, the personified underworld, the place of horrors, brought her forth. And Shinda herself is the mother of all terrors of the Chimera, Scylla, Goro, of a horrible Cerberus, of a Naaman lion, and the eagle who devoured the liver of Prometheus. Besides this, she gave birth to a number of dragons. One of her sons is Orpheus, the dog of the monsters. Gerin, who was killed by Hercules, with this dog her son, and Cheetah in incestuous intercourse produced the Sphinx. These materials will suffice to characterize the amount of libido which led to the Sphinx symbol. If in spite of the lack of subjective material, we may venture to draw an inference from the Sphinx symbol of our author, you must say that the Sphinx represents an original incestuous amount of libido detached from the bond of the mother. Perhaps it is better to postpone this conclusion until we have examined the following visions. After Miss Miller had consecrated herself again, the vision developed further. Suddenly an Aztec appeared absolutely clear in every detail, the hands spread open with large fingers, the head and profile armored headdress, similar to the feather ornaments of the American Indian. The whole was somewhat suggestive of Mexican sculpture. The ancient Egyptian character of the Sphinx is replaced here by American antiquity by the Aztec. The essential idea is neither Egypt nor Mexico, for the two could not be interchanged, but is a subjective factor which the dreamer produces from her own past. I have frequently observed in the analysis of Americans that certain unconscious complexes, such as repressed sexuality, are represented by the symbol of a Negro or an Indian. For example, when a European tells in his dream, then came a ragged, dirty individual for Americans, and for those who live in the tropics it is a Negro. When with Europeans it is a vagabond or a criminal, with Americans it is a Negro or an Indian, which represents the individual's own repressed sexual personality, and the one considered inferior. It is also desirable to go into the particulars of the vision, as there are various things worthy of notice. The feather cap, which naturally had to consist of eagle's feathers, is a sort of magic charm. The hero assumes at the same time something of the sun-like character of this bird when he adorns himself with his feathers, just as the courage and strength of the enemy are appropriated in swallowing his heart or taking his scalp. At the same time, the feather crests in a crown which is equivocal to the rays of the sun. The historical importance of the sun identification has been seen in the first part. A special interest attaches to the hand, which is described as open, and the fingers, which are described as large. It is significant that it is the hand upon which the distinct emphasis falls. One might rather expect a description of a facial expression. It is well known that the gesture of the hand is significant. Unfortunately, we know nothing about that here. Nevertheless, a parallel fantasy might be mentioned which also puts the emphasis upon hands. A patient in a hypnotic condition saw his mother painted on a wall like the painting of a Byzantine church. She held one hand up open wide with fingers spread apart. The fingers were very large, swollen into knobs on the ends, and each surrounded by a small halo. The immediate association with this picture was the fingers of a frog with sucking disc at the ends. Then the similarity to the penis. The ancient setting of this mother pictures is also of importance. Evidently the hand had in this fantasy a phallic meaning. This interpretation was confirmed by a further very remarkable fantasy of the same patient. He saw something like a skyrocket ascending from his mother's hand, which at a closer survey becomes a shining bird with golden wings. A golden pheasant as it then occurs to his mind. We have seen in the previous chapter that the hand has actually a phallic generative meaning, and that this meaning plays a great part in the production of fire. In connection with this fantasy, there is but one observation to make. Fire was bored with the hand, therefore it comes from the hand. Agni, the fire, was worshipped as a golden-winged bird. It is extremely significant that it is the mother's hand. I must deny myself to the temptation to enter more deeply into this. Let it be sufficient to have pointed out the possible significance of the hand of the Aztec by means of these parallel hand fantasies. We have mentioned the mother suggestively of the Sphinx. The Aztec taking place of the Sphinx points through his suggestive hand to parallel fantasies in which the phallic hand really belongs to the mother. Likewise, we encounter an antique setting in parallel fantasies. The significance of the antique, which experience has shown to be the symbol of infantile, is confirmed by Miss Miller in this connection in the annotation to her fantasies, for she says, "In my childhood I took a special interest in the Aztec fragments and in the history of Peru and of the Incas. Though the two analyses of children which have been published, we have attained an insight into the child's small world, and have seen what burning interests and questions secretly surround the parents, that the parents are for a long time the objects of the greatest interest. We are therefore justified in suspecting that the antique setting applies to the ancients, as say the parents, and that consequently this Aztec has something of a father or mother in himself. Up to this time, indirect hints point out only to the mother, which is nothing remarkable in an American girl, because Americans, as a result of the extreme detachment from the father, are characterized by a most enormous mother complex, which again is connected with the special social position of the woman in the United States. This position brings about a special masculinity among capable women, which easily makes possible the symbolizing into a masculine figure. After this vision, Miss Miller felt that a name formulated itself bit by bit, which seemed to belong to this Aztec, the son of an Incan of Peru. The name is Chi-Huan-Tepel, as the author intimated something similar to this belonged to her childish reminiscence. The act of naming is like baptism, something exceedingly important for the creation of a personality, because since olden times a magic power has been attributed to the name, with which, for example, the spirit of the dead can be conjured. To know the name of any one means in mythology to have power over that one. As a well-known example, I mention the fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin. In an Egyptian myth, Isis robs the sun god Re permanently of his powers by compelling him to tell her his real name. Therefore, to give a name means to give power, invest with a definite personality. The author observed in regard to the name itself that it reminded her very much of the impressive name Popocatépetl, a name which belongs to unforgettable school memories, and of the greatest indignation of a patient very often emerges in an analysis in a dream or fantasy, and brings with that same old school which one heard in school, told oneself and later again forgot. Although one might hesitate to consider this unhallowed joke as of psychologic importance, still one must inquire for the reason of its being. One must also put as a counter-question, why is it always Popocatépetl and not the neighboring Itzcoatl, or the even higher and just as clear O? The last is certainly the more beautiful and more easily pronounced name. P is impressive because of its onomatopoetic name. In English the word is to pop, pop gun, which is here considered onomatopoesie. In German the words are Hinterpermerm, pumpernickel. The frequent German word popo or podex does not indeed exist in English, but flatus is designated as to poop. In childish speech, the act of defecation is often designated as to pop. A joking name for the posterior part is the bum. Poop also means the rear end of a ship. In French, pouf is an onomatopoetic po for platsen, to explode. Poopin is a pet name for a chubby-faced child. In Dutch, pop, German, pup, and Latin, puppus is doll. Platus, however, it is also used jokingly for the posterior part of a body. The Greek word designates a crackling, snapping, or blowing sound. It is often of kissing. By Thersites, also the associated noise of flute blowing. The etymologic parallels show a remarkable relationship between the part of a body in question and the child. The relationship we still mention here, only to let it drop at once, as this question will claim our attention later. One of my patients in his childhood had always connected the act of defecation with the fantasy that his posterior was a volcano and a violent eruption took place. Explosion of gases and gushing forth of lava. The term for the elemental occurrences of nature are originally not at all poetical. One thinks, for example, of the beautiful phenomenon of a meteor, which the German language most unpoetically calls Sternschnuppe, the smoldering wick of a star. Certain South American Indians call the shooting star the urine of the stars. According to the principle of the least resistance, expressions are taken from the nearest source available. For example, the transference of metatomic expressions of urination as shiffins or to rain. Now it seems to be very obscure why the mystical figure of Chiweteltopil, who Miss Miller in a note compares to control spirit of a spiritualistic medium, is found in such a disreputable neighborhood that his nature was brought into relation with this particular part of the body. In order to understand this possibility, we must realize that when we produce from the unconscious the first to be brought forth into the infantile material long lost in memory, one must therefore take the point of view of that time in which this infantile material was still on the surface. If now a much-honored object is related in the unconscious to the anus, then one must conclude that something of a high valuation was expressed thereby. The question is only whether this corresponds to the psychology of the child. Before we enter upon this question, it must be stated that the anal region is very closely connected with veneration. One thinks of the traditional feces of the great Mongol. An Oriental tale has the same to say of Christian knights, who anointed themselves with the excrement of a pope and cardinals in order to make themselves formidable. A patient who was characterized by a special veneration of her father had a fantasy that she saw her father sitting upon the toilet in a dignified manner, and people going past greeted him effusively. The association of anal relations by no means excludes high valuation or esteem, as is shown by these examples, and as is easily seen from intimate connection of feces and gold. Here the most worthless comes into the closest relation with the most valuable. This also happens in religious valuations. I discovered at that time, to my great astonishment, that a young patient, very religiously trained, represented in a dream the crucified on the bottom of a blue-flowered chamber pot, namely in the form of excrements. The contrast is so enormous that one must assume that the valuations of childhood must indeed be very different from ours. This is actually the truth. Children bring to the act of defecation and the products of this an esteem and interest, which later on is possible only to the hypochondriac. We do not comprehend this interest until we learn about the child's very early connects with it a theory of propagation. The libido of flux probably accounts for the enormous interest in this act. The child sees that this is the way in which something is produced, in which something comes out. The same child whom I report in the little brochure, Über Konflikte der Kindliche Seele, who had a well-developed anal theory of birth, like little Hans, whom Freud made known to us, later contracted a habit of staying a long time on the toilet. Once the father grew impatient, went to the toilet and called, "Do come out of there. What are you making?" Whereupon the answer came from within, a little wagon and 2 ponies. The child was making a little wagon and 2 ponies, that is to say, things which at that time she especially wished for. In this way one can make that what one wishes, and the thing made is the thing wished for. The child wishes earnestly for a doll, or at heart for a real child. That is, the child practiced for his future biological task, and in the way in which everything in general is produced, he made the doll, himself as representative of a child or of a thing wished for in general. From a patient, I have learned a parallel fantasy of her childhood. In the toilet, there is a crevice in the wall. She fantasized that from this crevice, a fairy would come out and present her with everything for which she wished. The locus is known to be the place of dreams where much was wished for and created, which later would no longer be suspected of having a place of origin. A pathological fantasy in place here is told by the Lombroso concerning two insane artists. Each of them considered himself God and ruler of the world. They created or produced a world by making it come forth from the rectum, just as the egg of birds originates in the egg canal. One of these two artists was endowed with a true artistic sense. He painted a picture in which he was just in the act of creation. The world came forth from his anus. The membrum was in full erection. He was naked, surrounded by women, and with all insignia of his power. The excrement is in a certain sense that thing wished for, and on that account it receives a corresponding valuation. When I first understood this connection, an observation made long ago which disturbed me greatly, because I never rightly understood it, became clear to me. It concerned an uneducated patient who, under very tragic circumstances, had to be separated from her husband and a child, and was brought into the insane asylum. She exhibited a typical apathy and slovenliness which was considered as affective mental deterioration. Even at that time, I doubted this deterioration and was inclined to regard it as a secondary adjustment. I took especial pains to ascertain how I would discover the existence of the affect in the case. Finally, after more than 3 hours' hard work, I succeeded in finding a train of thought which suddenly brought the patient into a completely adequate and therefore strong emotional state. At this moment, the affective connection with her was completely re-established. That happened in the forenoon. When I returned at the appointed time in the evening to the ward to see her, she had, for my reception, smeared herself from head to foot with excrement, and cried laughingly, "Do I please you so?" She had never done that before. It was plainly destined for me. The impression which I received, one of a personal affront, and as a result of this I was convinced for years after the effective deterioration of such cases. Now we understand this act as an infantile ceremony of welcome or a declaration of love. The origin of Chawantopple, that is to say an unconscious personality, therefore means in the sense of a previous explanation. I make, produce, and vest him myself, is a sort of human creation or birth by the anal route. The first people were made from excrement, potter's earth or clay. The Latin ludum, which really means moist in earth, also has the transferred meaning of dirt. In Plautus, it is even a term of abuse, something like, "you scum." The birth from the anus also reminds us of the mode of throwing behind oneself. A well-known example is the oracular command which Deucalion and Pyrrha, who were the only survivors from the Great Flood, received. They were to throw behind them the bones of a great mother. They then threw behind them stones from which mankind sprang. According to a tradition, the dactyl is similar manner sprang from dust, which the nymph Anachile threw behind her. There is also humorous significance attached to the anal products. The excrements are also considered in popular humor as a monument or memorial, which plays a special part in regard to the criminal in the form of grummus murdae. Everyone knows the humorous story of the man who, led by the spirit through labyrinth passages to a hidden treasure, after he had shed all his pieces of clothing, deposited excrement as a last guide post on his road. In a more distant past, a sign of this kind possessed a significance as the dung of the animals to indicate the direction taken. Simple monuments, little stone figures, have taken the place of this perishable mark. It is noteworthy that Miss Miller quotes another case, where a name suddenly obtruded itself parallel to the emerging into consciousness of Chawatopple, namely Ahamarama with the feeling that it dealt with something Assyrian. As a possible source of this, there occurred to her Azurbama, who made cuneiform bricks, those imperishable documents made from clay, the monuments of the most ancient history. If it were not emphasized that the bricks are cuneiform, then it might mean ambiguously wedge-shaped bricks, which is more suggestive of our interpretation than that of the author. Miss Miller remarks that besides the name Azurbama, she also thought of Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. The fantasy leads to a very different aspect of the problem of unconscious personality. While the previous materials betrayed to us something of the infantile theory of creation, this fantasy opens up a visa into the dynamics of the unconscious creation of personality. Azaver is, as is well known, the wandering Jew. He is characterized by endless and restless wanderings until the end of the world. The fact that the author has thought of this particular name justifies us in following this trail. The legend of Azaver, the first literacy traces of which belong to the 13th century, seem to be of Occidental origin and belongs to those ideas which possess indestructible vital energy. The figure of a wandering Jew has undergone more literary elaboration than the figure of Faust, and nearly all of this work belongs to the local last century. If the figure is not called Azaver, still is there under another name, perhaps as Count of St. Germain, the mysterious Rosicrucian, whose immortality was assured and whose temporary residence the land was equally known. Although the stories about Azaver cannot be traced back any earlier than the 13th century, the oral tradition can reach back considerably further, and it is not an impossibility that a bridge to the Orient exists. There is the parallel figure of Shadir, or Achadir, the ever-youthful Schindler, celebrated in song by Ruckert. The legend is purely Islamic. The peculiar feature, however, is that C is only a saint, but in suffix circles, rises even to divine significance. In view of the severe monotheism of Islam, one is inclined to think of Sifidar as a pre-Islamic Arabian divinity who would hardly be officially recognized by the new religion, but might have been tolerated on political grounds. But there is nothing to prove that. The first traces of Shadir are found in the commentaries of the Quran. Bukhari and Tarabi are in a commentary to a noteworthy passage of the 18th surah of the Quran. The 18th surah is entitled The Cave, that is after the cave of the 7 sleepers, who according to the legend slept there for 309 years, and thus escaped persecution and awoke in a new era. Their legend is recounted in the 18th surah, and divers reflections were associated with it. The wish fulfillment idea of a legend is very clear. The mystic material for it is an immutable model of the sun's course. The sun sets periodically but does not die. It hides in the womb of the sea or in a subterranean cave, and in the morning is born again complete. The language in which the astronomic occurrence is clothed in one clear symbolism. The sun returns into the mother's womb, and after some time is again born. Of course, this event is properly an incestuous act, of which in mythology clear traces are still retained, not the least of which is the circumstance that the dying and resurrected gods are the lovers of their own mothers, or have generated themselves through their own mothers. Christ, as the God becoming flesh, has generated himself through Mary. Mithra has done the same. These gods are unmistakable sun gods, for the sun also does this, in order to again renew himself. Naturally, it is not to be assumed that astronomy came first and these conceptions of God afterwards. The process was, as always, inverted, and it is even true that primitive magic, charms of rebirth, baptism, superstitious usages of all sorts, concerning the cure of the sick, etc., were projected into the heavens. These youths were born from a cave, the womb of Mother Earth, like the sun gods in a new era, and this was the way they vanquished death. And this far, they were immortal. It is now interesting to see how the Quran comes after long ethical contemplations in the course of the same surah to the following passage, which is of special significance for the origin of the Chidler myth. For this reason, I quote the Quran literally. Remember when Moses said to his servant, "I will not stop till I reach the confluence of the two seas, or for 80 years will I journey on." But when they reached their confluence, they forgot their fish, and it took its way in the sea at will. And when they had passed on, Moses said to his servants, "Bring us our morning meal, for now we have incurred weariness from this our journey." He said, "What thinkest thou?" When we repaired to the rock for the rest, then verily I forgot the fish, and none but Satan made me forget it, so as not to mention it, and it hath taken its way in the sea in a wondrous sort. He said, "It is this we were in quest of." So they both went back, retracing their footsteps. Then found they one of our servants, to whom we had vouchsafed our mercy, and whom we had instructed with our knowledge. Moses said to him, "Shall I follow thee, that thou teach me for guidance of that which thou hast been taught?" He said, "Verily, thou canst by no means have patience with me, and how canst thou be impatient in matters whose meaning thou comprehendest not?" Trans Rodwell, page 188. Moses now accompanies the mysterious servant of God, who does divers things which Moses cannot comprehend. Finally, the unknown takes leave of Moses and speaks to him as follows. "They will ask thee of Dunkelarayan the two horns. Say, I will recite to you an account of him. Verily, we established his power upon the earth, and we gave him a means to accomplish every end, so he followed his way, until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it to set in a miry forest, and hard by he found a people." Now follows a moral reflection, then the narrative continues. Then he followed his course further until he came to the place where the sun rises. If now we wish to know who is the unknown servant of God, we are told in this passage he is Delarchian Alexander the sun. He goes to the place of setting, and he goes to the place of rising. The passage about the unknown servant of God is explained by the commentaries in a well-defined legend. The servant is Chitter, the verdant one, the never-tiring wanderer who roams for hundreds and thousands of years over lands and seas, the teacher and counselor of pious men, the one wise in divine knowledge, the immortal. The authority of the Tabari associates Chitter with Deucalion. Chitter is said to have reached the stream of life. As a follower of Alexander, and both unwittingly had drunk of it, so that become immortal. Moreover, Chitter is identified by the old commentators with Elias, who also did not die, but who was taken to heaven in a fiery chariot. Elias is Halos. It is to be observed that Azavar also owes his existence to an obscure place in the holy Christian scriptures. This place is to be found in Matthew 28. First comes the scene where Christ appoints Peter as the rock of his church and nominates him the governor of his power. After that follows the prophecy of his death, and then comes this passage. "Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Here follows the scene of the transfiguration. "And was transfigured before them, and his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elias talking with him. Then answered Peter and said unto Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If thou wilt, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one of thee, and one for Moses, and one for Elias." From these passages it appears that Christ stands on the same plane as Elias without being identified with him. although the people consider him as Elias. The Ascension places Christ as identical with Elias. The prophecy of Christ shows that there exists aside from himself one or more immortals who shall not die until parousia. According to John 22nd verse, the boy John was considered as one of these immortals, and in the legend he is, in fact, not dead but merely sleeping the ground until parousia, and breathes so that the dust swirls around his grave. As is evident, there are passable bridges from Christ by way of Elias to Chitter and Azarias. It is said in an account of this legend that Deucalion led his friend Cider to the source of life in order to have him drink of immortality. Alexander also bathed in the stream of life and performed the ritual ablutions. As I previously mentioned in a footnote, according to Matthew 12th verse, John the Baptist is Elias, therefore primarily identical with Chider. Now, however, it is to be noted that in the Arabian legend, Chider appears rather as a companion or accompanied. There are therefore two similar figures who resemble each other, but who nevertheless are distinct. The analogous situation in the Christian legend is found in the scene by the Jordan, where John leads Christ to the source of life. Christ is there the subordinate John, the superior similar to Deucalion and Chider, or Chider and Moses also Elias. The latter relation, especially in such that Vollers compares Chider and Elias on the one side, with Gilgamesh and his mortal brother Ebony on the other side, with the D one of whom is immortal and the other mortal. This relation is also found in Christ and John the Baptist on the one hand and Christ and Peter on the other. The last name parallel only finds its explanation through comparison with the Mithric mysteries, where the esoteric contents are revealed to us through monuments. Upon the Mithric marble relief of Clag Enfert, it is represented how with a halo, Mithra crowns Halos, who either kneels before him or else floats up to him from below. Mithra is represented on a Mithric monument of Osterberken, is holding in his right hand the shoulder of a mystic ox above Helios, who stands bowed down before him, the left hand resting on a sword hilt. A crown lies between them on the ground. Kamat observes about the scene that it probably represents the divine prototype of the ceremony of the initiation into the degree of Miles, in which a sword and a crown were conferred upon the mystic. Halos is therefore appointed the Miles of Mithra. In a general way, Mithra seems to occupy the role of patron to Halos, which reminds us of the boldness of Hercules towards Halos. Upon his journey towards Gerin, Halos burns too hotly. Hercules, full of anger, threatens him with his never-ending arrows. Therefore Halos is compelled to yield, and lends to the hero his son's ship, with which he was accustomed to journey across the sea. Thus Hercules returns to Etria, to the cattle herds of Gerin. On the monument at Klagenkerf, Mithra is furthermore represented pressing Halos' hand, either in farewell or as a ratification and further scene. Mithra mounts the chariot of Halos, either for the ascension of the sea journey. Kumat is of the opinion that Mithra gives to Halos a sort of ceremonious investiture and consecrates him with his divine power by crowning him with his own hands. This relation corresponds to that of Christ to Peter. Peter, through his symbols, the cock, has the character of sun god. After the ascension or sea journey of Christ, he is the visible pontiff of the divinity he suffers. Therefore, the same death crucifixion as Christ, and becomes the great Roman deity, the conquering triumphant church itself embodied in the Pope. In the scene of Malchus, he is always shown as the miles of Christ to whom the sword is granted, and as the rock upon which the church is founded. The crown is also given to him who possesses the power to bind and set free. Thus Christ, like the Son, is the visible God, whereas the Pope, like the heir of a Roman Caesar, is solus invicti comes. The setting sun appoints a successor, whom he invests with the power of the sun. Deucalion gives Chider eternal life. Chider communicates his wisdom to Moses. There even exists a report according to which the forgetful servant of Joshua drinks from the well of life, whereupon he becomes immortal and is placed in a ship by Chider and Moses as a punishment and is cast out to sea. Once more a fragment of sun myth, the motive of the sea journey. The primitive symbol which designates the portion of the zodiac in which the sun, with the winter solstice, again enters upon the yearly course is the goat, fish sign. The sun mounts like a goat to the highest mountain, and later goes into the water as a fish. The fish is the symbol of the child. For the child before his birth lives in the water like a fish, and the sun, because it plunges into the sea, becomes equally child and fish. The fish, however, is also a phallic symbol, also a symbol for the woman. Briefly stated, the fish is a libido symbol, and indeed as it seems predominantly for the renewal of the libido. The journey of Moses with his servant is a life journey, 80 years. They grow old and lose their life force libido, that is, they lose the fish which pursues its course in a marvelous manner to the sea, which means the setting of the sun. When the two notice their loss, they discover at the place where their source of life is found, where the dead fish revived and sprang into the sea, Chider wrapped in his mantle sitting on the ground. According to another version, he sat on an island in the sea, or in the wettest place on earth. That is, he was just born from the maternal depths, where the fish vanished. Chider, the verdant one, was born as a son of the deep waters. His head veiled, a caber, a proclaimer of divine wisdom, the old Babylonian Oannes Ah, who was represented in the form of a fish and daily came from the sea as a fish to teach the people wisdom. His name was brought into connection with John's, with the rising of a renewed sun. All that lived in the darkness as water, animal, or fish, surrounded by all terrors of night and death, became as the shining fiery firmament of the day. Thus the words of John the Baptist gain a special meaning. I indeed baptize you of water unto repentance, but he that cometh after me is mightier than I, whose shoes I am not worthy to bear. He shall baptize you with the Holy Ghost and with fire. With valors we may also compare Chider and Elias, Moses and his servant Joshua, with Gilgamesh and his brother Abani. Gilgamesh wandered through the world, driven by anxiety and longing to find immortality. His path led him across the seas to the wise Unthumpism Noah, who knew how to cross the waters of death. There Gilgamesh had to dive down to the bottom of the sea for the magical herb, which was to lead him back to the land of men. When he had come again to his native land, a serpent stole the magic plant from him. The fish again slid into the sea, but on the return from the land of the blessed, an immortal mariner accompanied him, who, banished by a curse of Unthanism, was forbidden to return to the land of the blessed. Gilgamesh's journey had lost its purpose on account of the loss of the magic herb. Instead, he is accompanied by an immortal, whose fate indeed we cannot learn from the fragments of the epic. This banished immortal is the model for Oziver, as Jensen aptly remarked. Again we encounter the motive of discovery, mortal and immortal, setting and rising sun. This motive is also represented as if projected from the hero. The sacrificium mithriscum, the sacrifice of a bull in its religious representation, very often flanked by the two Daedrephes, Caudes, and Cautaphetes, one with a raised and the other with a lowered torch. They represented brothers who reveal their character through the symbolic position of a torch. Cumont connects them, not without meaning, with the Cephacular erotes, who as genii with their reversed torches have traditional meaning. The one is supposed to stand for death and the other for life. I cannot refrain from mentioning the similarity between a sacrificium Mithericism, where the sacrificed bull in the center is flanked on both sides by Dadropathes, to the Christian sacrifice of a lamb. The crucified is also traditionally flanked by the two thieves, one of whom ascends to paradise while the other descends to hell. The idea of the mortal and the immortal seems to have passed also into the Christian worships. Semitic gods are often represented as flanked by two paradori, for example, Baal of Edessa, accompanied by Aziz and Manamaz. Baal is the sun, accompanied by Mars and Mercury, as expressed in astronomical teachings. According to the Chaldean view, the gods are grouped into triads. In this circle of ideas belongs also the Trinity, the idea of a triune God, in which Christ must be considered in his unity with the Father and the Holy Ghost. So too do the two thieves belong inwardly to Christ. The two Dadrophones are, as Kamat points out, nothing but offshoots from the chief figure of Mithra, to whom belongs a mysterious threefold character. According to an account of Dionysius Areopagita, the magicians celebrated a festival. An observation, likewise referring to the Trinity, is made by Plutarch concerning Ormond. The Trinity as three different states of a unity is also a Christian thought. In the very first place, this suggests a sun myth. An observation by Macrobius 118 seemed to lend support to this idea. As Cumont observes, Caudes and Catapultes occasionally carry in their hands the head of a bull and a scorpion. Taurus and Scorpio are equinoctial signs which clearly indicate that the sacrificial scene refers primarily to the sun cycle, the rising sun which sacrifices itself at the summer solstice, and the setting sun. In the sacrificial scene, the symbol of a rising and setting sun was not easily represented. Therefore, this idea was removed from the sacrificial image. We have pointed out above the Dioscuri represented in a similar idea, although in a somewhat different form. The one sun is always mortal, the other immortal. As this entire sun mythology is merely a psychologic projection to the heavens, the fundamental thesis probably is as follows. Just as man consists of a mortal and immortal part, so the sun is a pair of brothers, one being mortal, the other being immortal. This thought lies at the basis of all theology in general. Man is indeed mortal, but there are some who are immortal, or there is something in us which is immortal. Thus the gods, a Chider or a Saint German, are our immortal part which thought incomprehensible dwells among us somewhere. Comparison with the sun teaches us over and over again that the gods are libido. It is that part of us which is immortal, since it represents the bond through which we feel that in the race we are never extinguished. It is life from the life of mankind. Its springs which well up from the depths of the unconscious come as does our life in general, from the root of the whole of humanity, since we are indeed only a twig broken off from the mother and transplanted. Since the divine in us is the libido, we must not wonder what we have taken along with us in our theology ancient representations from olden times, which give the triune figure of a god. We have taken this from the phallic symbolism, the originality of which may well be uncontested. The male genitals are the basis for this trinity. It is an anatomical fact that one testicle is generally placed somewhat higher than the other. It is also a very old but nevertheless still surviving superstition that one testicle generates a boy and the other a girl. A late Babylonian bas-relief from Lahard's collection seems to be in accordance with this view. In the middle of the image stands an androgynous god, masculine and feminine face. Upon the right male side is found a serpent with a sun halo round its head. Upon the left, the female side, there is also a serpent with a moon above its head. Above the head of the god there are 3 stars. This in symbols would seem to confirm the trinity of a representation. The sun serpent at the right side is male. The serpent at the left side is female, signified by the moon. This image possesses a symbolic sexual suffix, which makes the sexual significance of the whole obtrusive. Upon the male side, a rome is found, a favorite symbol of the female genitals. Upon the female side, there is a wheel or felly. A wheel always refers to the sun, but the spokes are thick and enlarged at the ends, which suggest phallic symbolism. It seems to be a phallic wheel which was not unknown in antiquity. There are obscure bas-reliefs where Cupid turns a wheel of nothing but phalli. It is not only the serpent which suggests the phallic significance of the sun. I quote one especially marked case from an abundance of proof. In the antique collection of Verona, I discovered a late Roman mystic inscription in which are the following representations. These symbols are easily read: sun, phallus, moon, vagina, or a uterus. This interpretation is confirmed by another figure of the same collection. There the same representation is found, only the vessel. It is replaced by the figure of a woman. The impressions on coins where in the middle of a palm is seen encoiled by a snake, flanked by 2 stones, testicles, or else in the middle a stone encircled by a snake, to the right a palm, to the left a shell, or female genitals, should be interpreted in a similar manner. In Lahard's researches The Cult of Venus, there is a coin of Perga whereby Artemis of Perga is represented by a conical stone, which is phallically shaped and flanked by a man, claimed to be men, and by a female figure, claimed to be Artemis. Men, the so-called Lunas, is found upon the Attic bas-relief, apparently with a spear, but fundamentally a specter with a phallic significance flanked by Pan with a club, the phallus, and a female figure. The traditional representation of the crucified flanked by John and Mary is closely associated with the circle of ideas, precisely as is the crucified with the thieves. From this we see how beside the sun there emerges again and again the much more primitive comparison of libido with the phallus. And a special trace still deserves mention here. The dataphor Cotopus, who represents Mithra, is also represented with a cock and the pineapple. But there are the attributes of a figurian god Men, whose cult was widely diffused. Men was represented with Peleus, the pineapple, and the cock, also in the form of a boy, just as dataphores are boyish figures. This last name property relates them with men to the Cabri. Men has a very close connection with Attis, the son and lover of Cybele. In the time of the Roman Caesars, Men and Attis were entirely identified as stated above. Attis also wears the Peleus like Men, Mithra, and the dataphors. As the son and lover of his mother, he again leads us to the source of this religion-creating incest libido, namely to the mother. Incest leads logically to the ceremonial castration in the Attic Cybele cult for the hero, driven insane by his mother, mutilates himself. I must at present forgo entering more deeply into this matter because the incest problem is to be discussed at the close. Let this suggestion suffice. From different directions, the analysis of the libido symbolism always leads back again to the mother instinct. Therefore, we may surmise that the longing of the libido raised to God or pressed into the unconscious is a primitive, incestuous one, which concerns the mother. Through renouncing the virility to the first beloved, the mother, the feminine element, becomes extremely predominant. Hence the strongly androgynous character of a dying and resurrected Redeemer. That these heroes are nearly always wanderers is a psychologically clear symbolism. The wandering is a representation of longing, of the ever-restless desire which nowhere finds its object, for unknown to itself it seeks the lost mother. The wandering association renders the sun comparison easily intelligible. Also, under this aspect, the heroes always resemble the wandering sun, which seems to justify the fact that the myth of the hero is a sun myth. But the myth of the hero, however, is, as it appears to me, the myth of our own suffering unconscious, which has an unquenchable longing for all the deepest sources of our own being, for the body of a mother and through it for communion with infinite life in the countless forms of existence. Here I must introduce the words of a master who has divined the deepest roots of Faustian longings. Unwilling, I reveal a loftier mystery. In solitude are thrown the goddessness, no space around them, place and time still less. Only to speak of them embarrasses. They are the mothers, goddesses unknown to ye, the mortals named by us unwillingly. Delve into the deepest depths must thou to reach them. 'Tis final fault that we for help beseech them. Where is the way? No way to the unreachable, near to the trodden, a way to the unbeseechable, never to be sought. Art thou prepared? There are no locks, no latches to be lifted. Through endless solitudes shalt thou be driven. Hast thou through solitudes and deserts dared? And hast thou swum to the farthest verge of ocean, and there the boundless space beheld? Still hast thou seen wave after wave in motion, even though impending doom thy fear compelled. Thou hast seen something in the barrel dim, of peace-lulled seas the supportive dolphins swim, hast seen the flying clouds, sun, moon, and star. Naught shalt thou see in the endless void afar, nor hear thy footsteps fall, nor meet a stable spot to rest thy feet. Here, take this key. The key will scent the true place from all others. Follow it down, 'twill lead thee to the mothers. Descend then. I could also say ascend. 'Twere all the same, escape from the created shapeless forms and liberated spaces. Enjoy what long ere this was dissipated. Their worlds depressed like clouds on clouds unfolding. Then with stretched arms swing high the key thou holding. At last a blazing tripod tells thee this, that there the utterly deepest bottom is. Its light to thee will then the mothers show. Some in their seats, the others stand or go. At their own will, formation, transformation, the eternal mind's eternal recreation, forms of all creatures, there are floating free. They'll see thee not, for only wraiths they see. So pluck up heart, the danger then is great. Go to the tripod ere thou hesitate, and touch it with the key.